He walked into the restaurant with confidence. But before he could even sit down, the waiter looked him in the eye and said, "This place isn't for someone like you." Little did they know, he was the new mayor. This is The Seat at the Table, a powerful story set in Atlanta that will make you question how we treat others, who we exclude without even realizing it, and what true leadership really looks like. If you're someone who loves stories with strong moral lessons, powerful characters, and emotional depth, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that inspires and challenges the way we see the world. And as you listen, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were there? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Maybe your story will inspire someone. Now let's begin. In the heart of Atlanta, a black man walks into an upscale restaurant, only to be turned away with the words, "This place isn't for someone like you." What no one realizes is that the man they rejected is the city's new mayor, Malcolm Hayes, scheduled to officiate the restaurant's grand opening. What begins as a moment of blatant discrimination quickly unravels into a citywide reckoning, a confrontation with privilege, power, and the quiet rules that govern who gets a seat at the table. The Seat at the Table is a powerful story of identity, justice, and transformation. As Malcolm faces public judgment, political resistance, and personal doubt, he pushes forward, not to shame his city but to reshape it. Through conflict, reflection, and redemption, this story challenges us to ask, who decides who belongs, and what happens when someone refuses to stay silent? Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, places, or incidents portrayed are entirely the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. The events depicted are not based on any real individuals or occurrences. This video is intended to provide moral lessons, motivation, inspiration, and thought-provoking reflections for the viewer. Its purpose is educational and inspirational in nature. Viewer discretion is advised, and any resemblance to real-life situations is purely coincidental. The streets of downtown Atlanta shimmered under the glow of early evening lights. The city pulsed with its usual energy, cars weaving through lanes, pedestrians moving in choreographed chaos, and the ever-present hum of music and life spilling from street corners and restaurants. But tonight, a particular corner of Peachtree Street buzzed with something more refined, something exclusive. Bell and Birch, a brand new fine dining restaurant with marble floors imported from Italy and chandeliers flown in from France, stood gleaming and proud. Its grand opening had made headlines for weeks. Atlanta's elite were all expected to attend: city officials, cultural icons, entrepreneurs, and media influencers. Everyone who was anyone had received the custom gold-embossed invitation. Inside the restaurant, staff were polishing glasses until they sparkled, adjusting centerpieces with trembling fingers, and practicing smiles in the mirrors behind the bar. There was no room for error. The city's eyes would be on them tonight. Among the guests who had already arrived were council members, artists, and local celebrities. The restaurant had spared no expense. Every detail had been meticulously arranged, from the 5-course tasting menu designed by a Michelin-starred chef to the live jazz trio playing near the back wall. But outside the buzz and clinking glasses, at precisely 6:22 in the evening, a man stepped out of a black car and paused at the curb. Malcolm R. Hayes adjusted the sleeve of his gray suit jacket and looked up at the glowing sign of Bell and Birch. His shoes, though not glossy or flamboyant, were clean and polished. His tie was simple, his presence calm. With every step toward the restaurant, he carried a quiet confidence that did not demand attention, but it held it nonetheless. As he approached the entrance, a young valet smiled at him with a polite nod and reached out for his keys. Malcolm nodded back. "No car. Just walking in," he said. The valet blinked, confused, but said nothing. Malcolm stepped toward the entrance, where a hostess greeted a couple dressed in evening gowns and tuxedos. They were ushered in with practiced charm and soft laughter. But before Malcolm could take another step forward, a waiter, sharp-featured, dressed in sleek black, with a white towel folded across his arm, moved into his path. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said, his tone clipped and professional. "May I help you?" Malcolm offered a slight nod. "I'm here for the opening." The waiter's eyes briefly scanned Malcolm's suit, then his face, then flicked to the door behind him. "I'm sorry," the waiter said, lowering his voice. "This event is private." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "I'm aware. I was invited." "I see," the waiter said slowly. "Would you mind stepping to the side while I check the list?" Malcolm stepped back. The smile never left his face, though his eyes now carried a different light, one sharper, more observant. The waiter turned to the hostess, leaned in, and whispered something. The hostess looked over at Malcolm, frowned, then whispered back. After a few tense seconds, the waiter returned. "I'm afraid your name isn't on our initial guest list, sir. And we do have a strict dress code. Jackets must be black or navy. No gray suits. I hope you understand." Malcolm nodded once. "So it's about the suit?" "It's about the policy," the waiter replied with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This place isn't for someone like you." The words hung in the air. Not shouted. Not cruel. Just delivered. Casually. With assumed authority. Behind them, another couple walked past the velvet ropes and into the restaurant, their names instantly recognized by the hostess. Malcolm said nothing at first. His hands remained at his sides. But his voice when he did speak was clear. "Are you sure?" The waiter stiffened. "Yes, sir. I'm sure." At that moment, the restaurant manager appeared, alerted perhaps by the subtle shift in tension or a whisper from the staff. He was in his 40s, sleekly dressed, with slicked back hair and a walk that suggested experience. He approached with an apologetic smile already forming. "I'm sorry, is there a problem here?" he asked. The waiter spoke quickly. "This gentleman doesn't have a reservation or an invite. I was just explaining our dress code policy." Malcolm looked at the manager. "I was invited," he said simply. "I'd like to come in." The manager hesitated for a breath too long. "I understand, sir, but this is a very exclusive event. If you don't have a physical invitation, I'm afraid we can't." "Would you like to check the list yourself?" Malcolm asked, voice level. "We have a confirmed list," the manager said, eyes glancing down toward Malcolm's shoes. "And again, I'm afraid." "I see," Malcolm said. Then he stepped back. "Then maybe I'll wait here. Let's call the event organizer." Before the manager could respond, Malcolm pulled out his phone, pressed a button, and held it to his ear. The waiter's face twitched with something between doubt and annoyance. From inside, guests continued to arrive, greeted with champagne and flashes of cameras. None of them knew what was unfolding just outside the glass doors. After a brief conversation, Malcolm ended the call. He turned to the manager. "They'll be here shortly," he said. The manager's face shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to reconcile something in his mind. A silence fell over the entrance. And then the security guard stepped forward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises, sir," the guard said, crossing his arms. "I'm not leaving," Malcolm replied. "Then I'll call the police." Malcolm nodded. "Go ahead." The manager looked uneasy. "Sir, this really isn't necessary." But Malcolm said nothing else. He stood silently, the only movement coming from the slow ticking of his watch and the distant echo of jazz filtering through the restaurant doors. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights reflected off the polished windows of Bell and Birch. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, walking briskly toward the entrance. One of them, a younger officer with a hardened face, glanced at Malcolm and squared his shoulders. "You the one causing the disturbance?" the officer asked. Malcolm reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document. "Before you say anything," he said calmly, "take a look at this." The officer took the paper, unfolded it, and read. His expression shifted in an instant. He looked up, mouth slightly open. "Sir, I didn't realize. Inside someone screamed. The restaurant organizer had just gotten off the phone. Her face turned ghostly white. She ran to the door and flung it open, shouting to the manager. "He's the mayor," she said breathlessly. Gasps echoed behind her. People moved to the windows. Cameras flashed. The man they had turned away, questioned, and judged was Malcolm R. Hayes, the newly elected mayor of Atlanta, the one who was supposed to cut the ribbon and deliver the opening speech. And he had been standing outside this entire time, facing doubt, facing judgment, facing the same assumptions he had spent his life overcoming. But he never raised his voice. He never pushed back. He stood. He waited. And now everyone would have to see him, not just as a man in a gray suit, but as something far more powerful, as their leader, as their mayor, as the man with a seat at the table. Inside the restaurant, the mood shifted like a sudden change in weather. The once glittering ambience of clinking glasses and curated smiles dulled into a haze of tension. The sound of conversation dimmed. Eyes, now alert, darted toward the entrance where the restaurant organizer stood frozen, one hand still holding the phone, her lips parted as if still in mid-sentence. The name echoed in her mind. Malcolm R. Hayes, mayor of Atlanta. She turned slowly toward the window, where the silhouette of Malcolm stood framed by the glow of police lights. Her knees threatened to buckle. The manager, still processing her words, moved forward. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his jacket. "Mayor Hayes," he said, stepping outside. His voice trembled with a mixture of nerves and shame. "Please forgive the misunderstanding." Malcolm didn't look at him at first. His eyes were on the young officer still holding his identification. Then he looked at the manager, measured and slow. "I waited," Malcolm said. The manager forced a laugh, shallow and dry. We weren't informed of your arrival time, sir. There must have been a mix-up. Please come inside. We've been expecting you." Malcolm's voice remained quiet. "You weren't expecting me?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "We'll have your table ready immediately." From the side, the waiter who had initially turned Malcolm away hovered uncertainly. He didn't speak. His face was pale. The organizer approached, heels clicking hastily on the pavement. She reached out with a bright, apologetic smile, one Malcolm had seen 1,000 times before. "Mr. Mayor, I am so sorry," she said. "This is completely unacceptable. It was never our intention." "I'm sure it wasn't," Malcolm said calmly. He glanced back at the officer and nodded. The officer returned his identification with the care one reserves for sacred objects. Malcolm placed it back in his inner pocket, then turned to the restaurant. He stepped forward, and this time no one blocked his path. The velvet rope was held aside. The glass doors were opened wide. As Malcolm entered, the noise within the restaurant fell to silence. Guests turned toward him, some in recognition, some in dawning horror. The jazz trio stopped playing. One of the servers paused mid-step, holding a tray of sparkling wine. Malcolm didn't say a word. He walked forward with quiet purpose. Each footstep echoed like a gavel strike. Near the center of the dining room stood a small stage with a podium prepared for his speech. It had been placed beside a ceremonial ribbon, still intact. The ribbon-cutting scissors gleamed beneath a spotlight. Malcolm stopped at the foot of the stage. Behind him, the organizer rushed to catch up. "Would you like to give your speech now, Mr. Mayor?" she asked breathlessly. He turned and faced the room. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled every corner. "I will." He stepped up to the podium. The cameras turned toward him. Phones were lifted. A few flashes went off, uncertain whether to record the moment or lower their lenses in shame. Malcolm took a breath and looked over the crowd. "I wasn't going to say much tonight," he began. This was supposed to be a celebration. A night to enjoy the opening of a place meant to bring people together. A place to eat, to talk, to belong. He let his words hang in the air, letting the silence hold their weight. But then I was reminded, before I ever walked through that door, that some of us still have to prove our right to be here. That before I can speak, I must first be seen. Several guests looked down, embarrassed. The manager stood frozen, his hands clasped in front of him. "I was stopped," Malcolm continued, "not because I caused trouble, not because I broke any rule, but because I didn't look like the kind of man someone expected to see walking through these doors." He paused again. "Because of the color of my suit, because I came alone, because of my skin." A quiet gasp slipped from a table near the back. "I'm the mayor of this city," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly now, "but tonight I wasn't treated like a guest. I wasn't treated like a leader. I wasn't even treated like a man." Silence. He gripped the podium, not with anger, but with clarity. "There are young men and women all over this city watching how we treat one another. Watching to see what dignity looks like. Watching to see if a title is the only thing that buys you respect. And tonight they will hear this story. Not because I want revenge. Not because I want pity. But because they deserve to know the truth." He stepped away from the podium. The scissors lay untouched beside the ribbon. He reached for them, paused, then laid them down again. "I don't need to cut a ribbon to make a point," he said. "This place will open with or without my blessing. But if it truly wants to be a part of Atlanta's future, then let tonight be the last time anyone is judged by the door instead of welcomed through it." He turned. For a moment, no one moved. Then a few hands began to clap. First hesitant, then growing. The applause rolled through the room, polite, awkward, then genuine. Some guests stood. Others remained seated, their faces tight with guilt or confusion. Malcolm walked off the stage and toward an empty table by the window. One of the waiters rushed forward, stumbling over himself to pull out the chair. Malcolm sat, calm as ever. The same waiter who had turned him away stood near the entrance, frozen. Malcolm looked at him. Not with rage. Not with satisfaction. But with something heavier. Disappointment. The waiter lowered his head and stepped back. Outside, the jazz trio began to play again, uncertain at first, then finding their rhythm. Inside, people murmured quietly. Some resumed eating. Others approached Malcolm's table, offering apologies, asking for photographs, hoping to smooth the moment into something more comfortable. But Malcolm remained seated, looking out the window, watching the city he served, letting them see him, not as the mayor, but as a man. The night pressed on, heavy with the aftershock of revelation. Although conversation resumed and laughter returned in brittle fragments, something remained fractured in the atmosphere of Bell and Birch. The golden lighting, once warm and opulent, now cast longer shadows. Malcolm sat at his table alone. His glass of water remained untouched. Every so often, a new face would drift over, one of the city's well-heeled personalities or local dignitaries, offering a hand, a smile, a hollow apology. Malcolm responded politely, always politely, but his eyes wandered beyond them. He saw more than faces. He saw patterns. He saw repetition. He saw history. His mind slipped back through years, decades even, to a childhood memory carved into stone. It was the summer of 1989. He was only 10 years old, and his grandfather had taken him to the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery. They had stood under the southern sun, the black granite surface warm to the touch, water trickling over the names of those who had fallen, those who had marched, those who had dared to sit where others said they didn't belong. His grandfather's voice, low and certain, echoed in his memory now. "This isn't just a fountain, boy. It's a mirror. One day you'll look into it and see yourself." At the time he hadn't understood, but he remembered the way his grandfather stared into the smooth surface of the stone, not to see his own face, but to remember the ones who came before him, the ones who waited outside doors they were never meant to enter. Malcolm blinked slowly, returning to the present. He watched the waiter, the one who had turned him away, move nervously along the perimeter of the restaurant, avoiding eye contact, delivering drinks to others with robotic precision. The man had tried to stay invisible now, but invisibility didn't protect people. It never had. Malcolm stood up from his table. It took only a second before the room stilled again. He didn't walk toward the podium. He walked toward the waiter. The young man straightened, back stiff, eyes wide. His throat bobbed as he tried to say something, but nothing came out. Malcolm stopped directly in front of him. The distance between them was only a breath. "Do you know why I didn't leave?" Malcolm asked quietly. The waiter swallowed again, unsure if he was supposed to answer. "I stayed," Malcolm said, "because if I walked away you would never have learned who I am. And I want you to learn. I want you to remember this moment." The waiter nodded slowly. I'm sorry, sir." Malcolm studied him for a long second. Not just the words but the tone, the posture, the quiet desperation behind the eyes. "I believe you are," Malcolm replied. The waiter's lips parted as if to speak again, but Malcolm continued. "And maybe that's where change starts. Not in a headline, not in a post online, but right here, in the pause between assumption and understanding." A murmur of voices rippled behind them. Guests watched, shifting in their seats, some uncertain whether they were witnessing forgiveness or something else entirely. Malcolm turned from the waiter and walked toward the kitchen entrance. A pair of swinging doors revealed flashes of movement, the frantic hum of chefs still behind on orders, the clatter of pans, the sharp bark of instructions. The kitchen manager, a middle-aged man with flour on his apron and sweat on his brow, froze when he saw Malcolm step in. "Mr. Mayor," he said, voice caught in his throat. Malcolm didn't speak right away. He looked around the room. A young woman chopping vegetables near the back. A dishwasher humming to himself. A sous chef wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "I want to thank you," Malcolm finally said. "All of you. I know this wasn't your mistake, but I also know this is your space. And you've worked hard for tonight." The kitchen manager blinked. "We appreciate that, sir." "Truly." Malcolm nodded, then glanced at the swinging doors behind him. "That waiter out there, he's part of this team?" The manager hesitated. "Yes, sir. He's new. Been with us a few weeks. Then maybe you can help him grow. Help him understand what kind of city he's working in now." The manager stood taller. "Yes, sir. I can do that." Malcolm turned and left the kitchen, walking back into the dining room, which fell quiet once again. He returned to his table. Saturday. Waited. This time the waiter returned. Not with shame on his face but something else. A plate in his hands. Prepared with care. Presented with quiet dignity. The dish was placed gently before Malcolm, and for the first time that night, the mayor smiled. He lifted his fork. He took a bite. The jazz trio picked up a melody, soft, steady, familiar. A song born in pain, shaped by hope, and polished through years of survival. People resumed their meals. Voices returned. But no one forgot the night's beginning. And no one missed the image now standing clear before them. Malcolm R. Hayes. A black man in a gray suit. Seated, alone, in the very center of the room. Not at the edge. Not waiting by the door. But at the table. Exactly where he belonged. Morning rolled into Atlanta with a light mist and the low hum of awakening traffic. But unlike other mornings, this one carried a different weight. As sunlight pierced through the high-rise skyline, Bell and Birch sat beneath its glow like a freshly unveiled monument. Its windows clean, its brass sign polished, and yet its name whispered across the city not for its cuisine or decor, but for what had taken place the night before. The footage had spread like rain on glass. Short clips. Snippets. A black man turned away at the door. A badge revealed. A mayor's voice rising with grace rather than rage. The entire scene, captured in pixelated fragments from cell phones, was now stitched together in social media feeds and morning broadcasts, each voice narrating their own version of the truth. Some told the story with pride. Some with shame. Others, with fear that a single misjudgment had exposed something many had hoped was no longer true. Inside City Hall, the buzz was electric. Staffers walked quickly down polished floors, phones pressed to their ears. Reporters lined the building's marble steps before sunrise. The press secretary had already revised her morning statement twice, then discarded it altogether when Malcolm arrived. He wore no expression of triumph, only purpose. As he entered the building, reporters shouted his name. Mayor Hayes, did you plan to make a statement last night? Do you consider this a turning point in your term? Were you trying to make an example of the restaurant? He paused briefly but offered no response. Not here. Not now. There was work to do. Behind closed doors, he sat with his communications team. The video had gone viral. National outlets had picked it up. Civil rights leaders had reached out overnight. Donations to local justice programs had surged. Opinion pieces had already begun to swirl, some praising his composure, others dissecting his silence as strategy. But Malcolm wasn't interested in spin. He was thinking about the waiter. He was thinking about his grandfather. He was thinking about the mirror made of stone. Later that afternoon, Malcolm stood again behind a podium, this time in a sunlit atrium within City Hall. A glass wall behind him framed the skyline, a portrait of steel and resilience. He faced the cameras. Not just the ones held by news crews, but the hundreds of lenses watching from phones, tablets, and laptops across the city. Last night, Malcolm began, something happened in our city. Not a scandal. Not a protest. But a reflection. He paused. A reflection of where we are, and where we still need to go. He placed both hands on the podium, firm but calm. I wasn't surprised by what happened. Saddened, yes, but not surprised. Because every day people in this city, people who look like me, are still asked to explain their presence. Still told they don't belong. Still made to feel like intruders in spaces built on the very foundations they helped create. A rustle moved through the crowd. Cameras zoomed. Not one face blinked. But what we do next, that's what matters. He looked up, locking eyes with no one and everyone. I'm not here to punish a waiter. I'm not here to boycott a restaurant. I'm here to remind this city that accountability and grace can walk side by side. He took a breath. There will be mandatory inclusivity training for all city partners moving forward. That includes businesses receiving city funding or permits. And we will be expanding investment into programs that give our young people, especially our Black youth, access to leadership spaces. Not just so they can sit at the table, but so they can lead it. A few reporters jotted notes. Others watched, stunned by the clarity. I don't want your sympathy, Malcolm said softly. I want your awareness, your effort, your choice to see someone fully before deciding who they are. The silence held. Then applause rose. Not theatrical, not forced, but real. When Malcolm stepped down from the podium, a woman from the press pool approached him quietly. Mr. Mayor, she said, if you don't mind me asking, how do you stay so composed? Malcolm offered the faintest smile. I had a grandfather who reminded me that dignity is a choice, one no one can take from you. He nodded once and walked past the crowd. Outside, the city moved on. Trains ran. Stores opened. Schools buzzed with life. But something had shifted. In coffee shops and barbershops, on street corners and inside family kitchens, people talked about Malcolm Hayes. About the restaurant. About the door he wasn't allowed to enter. And how, by morning, he had already built another one. this time wide open. By the following week, the name Malcolm Hayes had become more than a title. It had become a symbol. Billboards that once bore simple mayoral slogans now shared space with powerful quotes from his speech. Grassroots organizations picked up the moment and ran with it. Campaigns were launched. Panels were scheduled. Conversations that had once been avoided began to take root in boardrooms and classrooms alike. But Malcolm wasn't interested in being a symbol. Symbols could be misused. He was building something that couldn't be co-opted, a culture shift grounded in reality. Bell and Birch remained open. Reservations remained full. But beneath the surface things had changed. The restaurant had issued a public apology, hired a diversity consultant, and committed to a quarterly report on inclusive hiring. Some called it performative. Others called it progress. But Malcolm knew that true change didn't arrive in press releases. It arrived in the quiet reshaping of people's daily behavior. Late one evening, well past dinner service, Malcolm returned, not with a media team or city escort, but alone. He entered the restaurant through the front door. This time, the host greeted him with warmth. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't hesitate. "Good evening, Mr. Mayor," she said. "Your table is ready." He smiled gently. "Thank you." He was led to a quiet table by the window, coincidentally the same one where he had eaten during the infamous opening night. The same one where he had first been seen as less than a guest. A different waiter approached. Young, black, and clearly nervous. "Sir," he said, voice steady but careful, "it's an honor to serve you tonight." Malcolm nodded, sensing the meaning behind the formality. As the waiter poured water into his glass, Malcolm glanced around the dining room. A couple nearby made eye contact and smiled respectfully. A trio of women in business attire raised their glasses toward him in a quiet toast. He didn't respond with a wave or a speech. He simply nodded, an acknowledgement that spoke louder than words. Halfway through his meal, the restaurant's owner appeared at his table. Her posture was tentative, her presence heavy with responsibility. "Mr. Mayor," she began softly, "I wanted to thank you for giving us another chance." Malcolm folded his napkin beside his plate. "I didn't come for a second chance," he replied. "I came to see what you'd do with the first." The owner looked down, absorbing the weight of that statement. "We're still learning," she said, "but we're committed to doing better. Truly." "I believe you," Malcolm said, "and I'll be watching." She nodded, said nothing more, and walked away. Later that night, as the restaurant cleared out and lights dimmed, Malcolm remained seated. He looked through the glass at the city, his city. A city built on resistance and rhythm. A city scarred by injustice, yet always finding new ways to heal. He thought about the phrase people had begun using since that night, a seat at the table. But to him it was more than a phrase. It was a reckoning. A seat at the table wasn't just about inclusion. It was about authorship. About who sets the menu, who picks the chairs, who decides the size of the table to begin with. And Malcolm intended to reshape the table altogether. Not with wood and nails, but with loss, with empathy, with leadership that remembered its own story. As he stood to leave, he left a generous tip on the table. Not just in money, but an example. A lesson in how to respond without bitterness. How to lead without vengeance. How to be seen not as a symbol, but as a man who remembers what it means to be denied, and who refuses to let it happen to the next one in line. Outside, the streets hummed. Not with sirens or speeches, but with the quiet, unfolding sound of change. The weeks that followed brought more than headlines and praise. They brought scrutiny. In the mayor's office, letters poured in, some handwritten, others typed with bureaucratic polish. Messages of support arrived from city mayors in Boston, Chicago, and Oakland. But not every letter was warm. A few questioned his judgment, wondering aloud if the mayor had turned a social misstep into a political stage. Malcolm read each letter carefully. He did not respond in anger. He responded with data. At the next city council meeting, Malcolm walked in with a binder, not filled with opinion but with numbers. Pages of metrics showing how exclusionary practices, both subtle and overt, impacted the city's economy, health, education, and housing. A system, he explained, didn't need bricks or chains to keep people out, it only needed silence and habit. Behind him stood representatives from communities across Atlanta. Teachers, pastors, small business owners, and even young students who had been watching it all unfold. "This city has its roots in resilience," Malcolm said, addressing the council. "But we can't honor our history if we ignore its echoes." He proposed an initiative called the Blueprint, a comprehensive policy package focused on economic equity, leadership access, and cultural accountability. Its pillars were simple. Representation. Every city-sponsored board or panel must include voices from underrepresented communities. Education. All public high schools would integrate a curriculum module centered on Atlanta's racial history, not just the past but the present. Opportunity. A new fund would support mentorship and entrepreneurship programs for youth in overlooked zip codes. Training. Any business seeking city partnership or grant support would be required to complete a certified inclusivity program. It wasn't a radical blueprint, but it was a necessary one. Some council members hesitated, citing budget constraints or political risk. But others, especially those who had watched the video from Bell and Birch, understood that this wasn't about one restaurant or one man. It was about the systems that quietly shape decisions before anyone realizes the damage done. Malcolm didn't argue with the doubters. He let the testimony of others carry the message. Like the teacher who spoke about her student being followed through a department store. Or the small business owner whose grant applications had been denied 4 times with no clear reason. Or the teenage girl who stood at the microphone and said, "I just want to know what it feels like to be expected somewhere, not tolerated." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it passed. And with it, Atlanta shifted again, subtly, structurally. Later that night, Malcolm didn't attend a celebration. He drove alone to the south side. Pulled into a quiet lot outside an old civic center where his mother used to take him for community events. He stepped out and stood there, breathing in the scent of warm concrete and spring air. A mural stretched along one wall, faded but still proud. It showed black leaders through the ages, teachers, activists, artists, and mayors. Malcolm's face wasn't there, and he didn't want it to be, because this wasn't about becoming history. It was about making space for those still fighting to be seen. A group of teenagers passed by on their bikes, slowing as they noticed him. "You the mayor?" one of them asked, breathless from the ride. Malcolm nodded with a soft smile. "Yeah, I am." "You're the one from that video, right?" "I am." The boys exchanged looks. One of them raised his chin and said, "That was cold, man. You handled that like a boss." Malcolm laughed just a little. "Thanks," he said. "You guys doing okay?" "We good," the boy replied. "You coming to the rec center tomorrow?" "I might," Malcolm said. "Depends if I'm expected." One of the other boys shrugged. "You are now." They rode off, wheels squeaking against the pavement, voices fading into the distance. And for a moment, Malcolm just stood there watching the place where they had disappeared. A city changed through the slow grind of effort. A seat claimed not for him alone, but for all those still arriving. The air in Atlanta grew heavy as spring pressed closer to summer. Heat clung to sidewalks and filtered through the iron gates of old neighborhoods. The city pulsed with anticipation, not the kind sparked by festivals or concerts, but the weightier hum of civic attention. Malcolm Hayes had become the face of progress. But progress, even when noble, never comes without resistance. Opposition began to rise, not in mobs or marches but in memos and backroom meetings. A coalition of local business owners, some quietly influenced by deep-pocketed lobbyists, began organizing against the inclusivity mandates from the blueprint. They framed their argument not as prejudice but as practicality. Too much regulation. Unfair expectations. Infringement on business freedom. On talk radio, hosts began spinning stories. Should one man's experience dictate policy for an entire city? Is this about justice or about power? Malcolm watched as his inbox filled with cautious messages. Allies hesitated before showing public support. Campaign donors pulled back quietly, some citing concerns about overreach. It didn't surprise him. He had learned early that every new bridge would expose the width of the river beneath. In a private meeting with his closest advisors, Malcolm listened carefully as they laid out potential risks. "Your approval ratings are strong," one advisor said, "but they've dipped slightly among moderate voters." "The restaurant incident gained you national attention," another added. "But this blueprint, some folks see it as pushing too far, too fast." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then he said, "If we're losing ground because we told the truth, then that's not ground I want to stand on." Silence filled the room. No one disagreed, but they all knew what was coming next. The following week, during a scheduled appearance at a Midtown business forum, Malcolm stood on stage in front of a crowd that included some of his loudest critics. Tension buzzed in the air. The moderator offered a polite introduction and quickly moved to the heart of the event, a panel on economic responsibility. A local property developer raised the first question. "Mr. Mayor, with all due respect, we've worked hard to create jobs and grow this city. But some of us feel that your new regulations punish us for things we didn't do. Isn't there a risk in alienating the very businesses that fuel Atlanta's growth? Malcolm didn't blink. He stepped forward slowly, gripping the sides of the podium with both hands. I appreciate your honesty, he said, and I'm going to respond with some of my own. He scanned the crowd, half skeptical, half waiting. There's a cost to change. Always has been. But the real question isn't whether these policies are inconvenient. The real question is, why weren't we doing this already? A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Why does a basic call for fairness and inclusion feel like punishment to you? He continued. Why is asking businesses to see the people who live in this city, really see them, considered too much? No answer came. Just the steady hush of people processing words that couldn't be dismissed as sound bites. I'm not trying to break your business, he said. I'm trying to build a city that works for all of us. That includes you. But it also includes the mother who cleans your building, the boy who bags your groceries, the girl who's told she's not qualified for a job before she even walks in the room. He paused. I know what it costs to stay composed. I know how much it takes not to raise your voice when the world keeps asking if you belong. He took a breath deeper this time. And I will not apologize for using my seat to make sure someone else gets theirs. Silence again. But not the kind that signals discomfort. The kind that signals understanding, even if it's reluctant. When the forum ended, some attendees left quickly, avoiding eye contact. But others stayed. A few approached him cautiously. One woman, an older executive in a tailored gray suit, spoke softly as she shook his hand. I didn't vote for you, she said. But I respect what you're doing. Malcolm nodded. That's a start, he replied. Outside, the press was already waiting. They called his name. Asked if he was prepared to face backlash from the business community. Asked if he planned to soften his position. But he gave no new speech. He simply walked toward his car, coat over his shoulder, head high, not defiant, just certain. Because composure, he knew, wasn't weakness. It was armor. And in this city, that armor had become necessary not just to survive, but to lead. Night fell slowly over Atlanta, as if the city itself needed extra time to process all it had been through. But under the streetlights and corporate glow, another kind of light burned hotter, the unrelenting beam of public scrutiny. Malcolm's name had gone national again. Not because of another confrontation or speech, but because someone had leaked internal city documents. Emails. Notes from closed-door meetings. Budget drafts for the blueprint. News outlets picked them apart like vultures circling an unfinished meal. Did Mayor Hayes bypass traditional approval channels? Was there undue pressure placed on departments to fast-track new policies? One headline screamed in bold, progress or power grab. Malcolm sat in his office late into the night, reading through the reports, watching the media storm spiral into something sharp. His chief of staff, Nia, stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes tired. We're getting calls from the ethics board, she said. And the city attorney. They want to review everything. He nodded once. Not with surprise but with resolve. Let them, he said quietly. We've got nothing to hide. But Malcolm knew the truth. It was never about hiding. It was about how easily the truth could be twisted in the hands of those who feared what it threatened. The next morning, City Hall was surrounded by more reporters than usual. They lined the marble steps like spectators at a trial. Microphones, cameras, fast-talking anchors. Malcolm walked through them without slowing. Inside, a small emergency meeting had been called. Council members and legal advisors waited in the chamber. Some faces carried concern. Others looked like they had already chosen sides. The chair of the Oversight Committee cleared her throat and began. Mayor Hayes, this review is not a legal accusation. But given the sensitivity of recent developments, we feel it is necessary to examine your administration's conduct with transparency. Malcolm stood behind the podium again, not as a symbol this time, but as a target. I welcome your questions, he said, and your accountability. But let me be clear. I will not apologize for making this government move faster than it's comfortable doing, because comfort is how injustice survives. He laid out each step his administration had taken. Documented approvals, emails with department heads, budgets passed through proper channels. It was all there, meticulously kept, because Malcolm had known this moment would come. They always come for the ones who build too boldly. Still, the shadows cast by suspicion didn't fade easily. That night, in a small diner off Edgewood Avenue, Malcolm met quietly with one of his oldest friends, Darius, a civil rights attorney who'd grown up 2 streets over from him. Darius sipped his coffee and stared across the table. They want to chip away at your credibility, he said. Because they can't argue with the message, so they attack the messenger. Malcolm gave a tired smile. They want to make me look reckless, unstable, angry. Darius leaned forward. You're none of those things. But you better remember, this system was not built to praise your calm. It was built to punish your resistance. Outside, the rain began to fall. Gentle at first, then steadier. The kind of southern rain that cleans the dust off rooftops but never fully cools the heat in the air. Malcolm looked out the window, watching as droplets streaked the glass. He thought about everything he had fought for. Not just this year, but every year since he was a boy trying to find dignity in a world that expected him to shrink. He would not shrink. Not now. Back at City Hall the next day, the committee delivered its findings. There had been no misconduct. No broken laws. No shortcuts that would hold up in court. Malcolm had been cleared. But the message had been set. Keep pushing and the system will push back. Still, that night, as the city returned to its usual rhythms, something new stirred. People weren't just watching Malcolm anymore. They were listening. Not to defend him, but to join him. Teachers began writing to city council, asking for more resources tied to the blueprint. Church leaders spoke from pulpits about truth over comfort. And in neighborhoods once ignored by downtown policymakers, murals began appearing. Not of Malcolm, but of chairs. Wooden chairs. Office chairs. Dinner table chairs. Each one painted beside a phrase that now echoed through the streets of Atlanta. We all deserve a seat. And in that quiet, growing chorus, Malcolm saw it clearly. The spotlight would come and go. But the shadows it cast? Those were the spaces where real change could take root. The gold-plated sign above the restaurant gleamed under the soft glow of a renovated entryway. Bell and Birch had undergone changes, not just in decor but in culture. Gone were the narrow booking policies and unspoken gatekeeping customs. The staff roster had diversified, training had been implemented, and the owners, under the careful guidance of their new equity partner, had issued a public commitment to rebuild their brand through humility and action. But despite all the transformation, the restaurant remained a symbol. And tonight, its history was about to come full circle. A year had passed since the day Malcolm Hayes was turned away at its entrance. The grand reopening was not just a marketing play, it was an event to mark the city's new civic holiday, Community Inclusion Day. Inside, the room was filled with citizens from every corner of Atlanta. Not just politicians and press, but teachers, bus drivers, artists, and activists. Those who'd never had an invitation to a table like this one now sat at the center of it. A jazz quartet played low and smooth as conversations drifted between laughter and reflection. At the center of the room, a long table had been set for the city's leadership. But there was one seat intentionally left empty, facing the main podium. When the moment arrived, the restaurant's co-owner, Thomas Gray, stepped forward. He wore a dark suit and a sober expression. Gone was the arrogance of a year ago. In its place stood a man who had come face to face with his own blind spots, and chosen to see. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the moment that brought us here, Thomas said, his voice steady but low. We failed. Not just in how we treated one man, but in what we represented when we did. This place was built with pride, but that pride blinded us. And we're still learning what it means to open our doors, not just physically but intentionally. He paused and nodded toward the empty seat. That chair was once denied to someone. Tonight it belongs to him. A quiet hush settled across the room as Malcolm approached the podium. He wore a tailored navy suit, simple and clean, his tie bearing the symbol of the city seal, oak branches for strength, a phoenix for rebirth. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. When I walked into this restaurant last year, Malcolm began, I was just looking for dinner. But what I found was a mirror. He scanned the faces before him, not just black and white, but every shade and story Atlanta had to offer. It wasn't the rejection that shocked me. It was how normal it felt to the people who witnessed it. No one interrupted. I didn't plan to turn that moment into a movement, but sometimes life doesn't wait for permission. It simply knocks, and if you don't open the door, it keeps knocking until you do. He turned briefly toward the empty chair, then back to the crowd. This chair was never about me. It's about everyone who has been told they don't belong, not with words, but with silence, with hesitation, with policy. He looked toward Thomas and offered a slight nod. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. And it takes even more to change what you've built. A beat passed. And so, tonight I take my seat. Not because I need it, but because others still do. With that, he stepped forward and pulled out the chair. He sat. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a reminder. The room rose in applause, not loud but long. The kind that settles into your ribs and makes you feel the history in your breath. After the speech, conversations resumed. People mingled, new faces met, and old tensions softened like candle wax. Toward the back of the room, a young woman approached Malcolm. She held a notepad in her hand and wore the wide-eyed energy of someone still new to journalism. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I'm writing a piece for my campus paper. Can I ask you one thing?" He smiled. "Of course." She hesitated. "How do you stay calm when the world wants you angry?" He considered her for a moment, then said, "Anger is real. It has its place. But I've learned something more dangerous than rage: apathy. If I stay calm, it's not because I'm not furious. It's because I want to turn that fire into light." She wrote the words down slowly, then looked up again. "Thank you," she said. "No," he replied gently. "Thank you for asking." Later, as the event wound down and the music shifted into mellow chords, Malcolm slipped away from the crowd. Outside, the air was cooler, and the city lights shimmered across the tops of quiet buildings. He looked back once at the glowing restaurant behind him. Not for nostalgia, but for perspective. The fight was not over, but the map had changed, and now more people knew the way to the table. Atlanta woke to a sunrise stitched in gold, the kind that made brick buildings blush and cast soft shadows across sidewalks still damp from last night's rain. It was a Saturday, but the city stirred early. The first Community Inclusion Day had been declared a citywide observance. Streets were closed off not for protests, but for celebration. Booths lined neighborhoods from Buckhead to Bankhead, offering free food, art installations, and open forums on equity. Schools hosted storytelling sessions. Libraries featured exhibits on local civil rights icons, past and present. And in the heart of the city, in front of City Hall, a wooden stage had been set up, surrounded by folding chairs, lawn blankets, and rows of children eating shaved ice under the watching gaze of their parents. Malcolm stood backstage, watching the city breathe as one. It didn't look perfect. It wasn't meant to. Progress never wore a flawless face. Nia approached with a clipboard in hand. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded. "Always." As he stepped onto the stage, applause rippled out like a slow wave, not frenzied, not choreographed, just real. The kind of applause that came from people who had watched him not only talk but endure. Malcolm held no papers. He didn't need them. He looked out at the faces before him, young and old, hopeful and hardened. A city that had seen too much and still refused to look away. "A year ago," he began, "we were tested. Not by disaster or scandal, but by something quieter. A moment that asked us, who belongs here?" He scanned the crowd. "You answered that question. With your voices, your votes, your patience, your anger, your action." He gestured toward the edges of the plaza, where murals had been painted in the weeks leading up to the event. One showed a line of mismatched chairs stretching across a map of the city. Wooden, metal, plastic, leather. All different. All equal. "This isn't a holiday about what I went through," he continued. "It's about what we go through, every time someone is told to wait their turn. Every time a door is closed quietly. Every time silence is mistaken for peace." The audience was still. Not in boredom, but in collective stillness. Some held hands. Others wiped at the corners of their eyes. "We remember this day," he said, "not because the work is finished, but because we've named it. And when we name something, we no longer allow it to hide." He stepped back slightly and gestured toward the crowd. "The seat I took wasn't just for me. It was for all of you. And it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of one we're writing together." As applause rose again, a group of schoolchildren moved onto the stage behind him, each carrying a chair. One painted red, one green, one blue, one gold. They placed them at the front edge of the platform, then turned to face the crowd. One little boy, no older than 9, stepped forward. His voice was clear, rehearsed but proud. "This is our city. And in our city, everyone gets a seat." The audience erupted. This time not just with applause, but with the joy of recognition. The sound of people seeing themselves reflected in the mirror of their leadership. Later that evening, as dusk rolled in and the celebration wound down, Malcolm walked the streets alone for a while. He passed murals, heard music drifting from windows, and exchanged nods with strangers who now saw him as more than a politician. He turned a corner and found himself outside Bell and Birch again. The lights were dimmed. The dinner rush over. A waiter, young and brown-skinned, mopped the floor behind the glass. Malcolm watched for a moment, remembering the night he was turned away, the silence that fell, the weight he carried as he walked off into the unknown. But tonight there was no tension, just reflection. He stepped closer to the window, not to go inside, but to honor the full arc of the moment. Across the street, an older man sitting on a stoop gave a small wave. Malcolm returned it, then turned and walked on. Because a seat at the table was never the destination. It was the foundation. And Atlanta had finally begun building on it. Brick by brick, voice by voice, day by day. A city that once asked who belonged had answered clearly and collectively, all of us. Here are 7 moral lessons that can be drawn from this story. 1. True leadership is rooted in humility and purpose, not ego. Malcolm Hayes did not seek power to elevate himself, but to serve a greater vision of justice and equity. He used his position not as a pedestal, but as a platform to uplift others, especially those silenced or overlooked by society. 2. Dignity should never depend on appearance or background. The initial rejection Malcolm faced at Bell and Birch was based solely on race and assumption. The story reminds us how dangerous it is to judge someone's worth by surface-level traits, and how everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of status. 3. Systemic change requires persistence, not just outrage. While the incident at the restaurant could have become just another viral headline, Malcolm channeled that moment into a larger movement. He didn't let the fire of public anger burn out. He turned it into lasting fuel for civic reform and cultural introspection. 4. Redemption begins with acknowledgement, not denial. Bell and Birch eventually transformed, but only after its leadership confronted their prejudice and took tangible steps toward change. The story shows that healing and progress are possible, but only through honesty and accountability. 5. Representation matters, in every room, at every table. When marginalized people are excluded from places of power, their communities remain voiceless. Malcolm's presence as a black mayor at the head of government and eventually at that once restrictive restaurant became a living symbol of change and inclusion. 6. Every act of discrimination, no matter how small, has deep consequences. The story starts with a single sentence. This place isn't for someone like you. But from that one act of bias, a city was forced to confront its own complicity. Small actions reveal large truths. What we allow in silence shapes the world we live in. 7. Justice is not about revenge, it's about restoration. Malcolm never sought to punish those who wronged him. Instead, he chose the harder path, restoring broken trust, creating room for dialogue, and building systems that would outlive his personal experience. Justice in this story means healing the whole, not dividing it further.